Let me start first with a presentation to cover the natural resources dimension of fragility. With this, we will have a recorded presentation by Mr. Nick Voulvoulis, a professor of environmental technology at the Imperial College of London, to give us a short, let's say, insights into the natural resources dimension of fragility. So I leave you listening and seeing it.
Good afternoon. Thank you again for inviting me to give a talk on the natural resources dimension of fragility. My name is Nick Voulvoulis. I am a professor of environmental technology at the Center for Environmental Policy at Imperial College in London. And the title of my talk is Drylands and Natural Resources Driven Fragility. Fragility is conceptualized by the OECD as the combination of exposure to risks and the insufficient coping capacity of a state, a system, or a community to manage, absorb, and mitigate those risks. It poses a major global threat to the achievement of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and for sustaining peace, especially considering the impacts of the current COVID-19 pandemic. Issues related to the environment directly shape the drivers of fragility. Although environmental factors are rarely favor the sole cause of conflicts and social unrests, the exploitation of natural resources and related environmental stresses can be implicated in raising fragility and leading to conflict. For example, in the last 60 years, at least 40% of all intrastate conflicts had a link to natural resources. And since 1990, at least 18 violent conflicts have been fueled by the exploitation of natural resources. Restricted and unequal access to natural resources and their improper management, coupled with environmental constraints, are putting efforts for development at risk. Under these conditions, the capacity of the poorest to deal with global pressures on resources is undermined, and food security is threatened. The emerging consensus is that environmental factors and natural resources scarcity can be amongst the main drivers of fragility, as ecosystems with limited coping capacities are less resilient to stresses and shocks. However, risks related to natural resources and their management are often overlooked or misdiagnosed in analysis of fragility, leading to missed opportunities when designing effective responses. One way of looking at natural resources is through the water, energy, and food nexus. Delivering water, energy, and food for all in a sustainable and equitable way is one of the major challenges faced by our societies. For example, globally, 2.2 billion people do not have access to safely managed drinking water, and 940 million do not have access to electricity, and 811 million do not have access to adequate food. Fair access to and effective management of these resources is essential to public health, state legitimacy, livelihood security, and economic prosperity. All of these are necessary components to countering fragility and fostering stability. This is the reason why the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations has joined forces with us here at the Center for Environmental Policy at Imperial College in London on an ambitious project under the Building Forward Better initiative to develop a tool for the mapping of natural resources driven fragility. Again, we followed a water, energy, and food nexus approach in which we calculated the availability and demand difference for water, energy, and food in each country, creating an integrated ref nexus score calculated as a net surplus or deficit across the nexus as a more explicative indicator that can be used to make decisions on policies and technology selection and optimization. For example, if a country has enough energy but not water, a candidate to consider is desalination. Similarly, a country that doesn't have enough energy but water, you could think of biofuels and other technologies like aquaponics in the case of food and so on. So we looked at these three resources in terms of availability and demand. We looked at internal renewable water resources per country, and also the total freshwater withdrawal, total production of energy and total consumption per country, and also food production and food supply. We then integrate these as resources deficits or surpluses, which we use later as an indicator of fragility. For example, here you can see resources, reserves, or deficits per country in terms of water, energy, and food. Now, for this, we have actually taken into account when we calculate demand, not just the current demand, but the demand that we would expect if the rest of the world has reached the same level of development across the planet. So on the left, you can see with red countries, for example, that do not have enough water to meet their water needs. On the right, countries in red that do not have energy, or the energy consumed is more than the energy produced. And the same situation with food for those that are red. The green ones are the ones that have a surplus in terms of these resources. We also take into account a number of confounding factors, parameters that affect the fragility as well. These are related to the economic development and growth and access to technology, the management of the natural resources, and also climate change elements that might affect the overall fragility of a state. This is an example of how the integrated map looks like. And here you can see with red countries that overall they have less resources available than what they need to meet the needs of their citizens. Now let's look at drylands. Drylands are defined by the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification as regions with an aridity index of between 0.05 and 0.65. Where the aridity index is the ratio of annual precipitation to potential evapotranspiration. Drylands are important areas. They cover 41.3% of the Earth's land surface, including 15% in Latin America, 66% in Africa, 40% in Asia, and 24% in Europe. They're home to more than 2.1 billion people, 90% of which live in developing countries. Drylands normally refer to arid, semi-arid, and dry subhumid areas, and in general exclude deserts or hyper-arid areas when referred to in the context of sustainable development. Overall, they are characterized by limited water availability, high temperature fluctuations, and an average annual precipitation rate below 2/3 of the annual potential evapotranspiration. Drylands are most valuable and rich biodiversity, made up of forests, grasslands, and agricultural areas. The first global assessment of dryland forests found that drylands include 2/3 of the land area of 7 biodiversity hotspots and contain 1.1 billion hectares of forest, corresponding to over a quarter of the world's forest area. So this is a map of countries according to the percentage of their total area covered by drylands. So for example, the ones in red are those that more than 90% of their area is actually designated as drylands. There are two more categories in terms of the extent of coverage by drylands, and they're easier to show in the next slide. So here, in addition to the first group, which is the countries with 90% of their land covered by drylands, the second group is those countries that have land between 30 to 90% covered by drylands, and the last group on the right is those that have less than 30% of their land covered by drylands. These groupings are interesting because we'll use them to do some further analysis. Here, for example, you see that countries with a high percentage of drylands have significantly less water available and produce less food. Also, some of them indeed produce more energy. Water, food, and energy security are crucial for sustainable long-term economic growth and human well-being, and there are strong linkages between them. It is important to understand how these are limited in drylands because they are the reasons that drive some of the fragility we see in these areas. So drylands are extremely vulnerable to climatic variations and water stress. They're also extremely vulnerable to damaging human activities such as deforestation, overgrazing, and unsustainable agricultural practices, which cause land degradation. When we refer to land degradation, we really refer to the loss of the biological or economic productivity of land. Desertification reduces agricultural output, contributes to droughts, and increases human vulnerability to climate change. The pace of land degradation has actually accelerated in recent years, reaching 30 to 35 times the historical rate. Urbanization, mining, farming, and ranching are some of the causes for this. Today, more than 2 billion hectares of previously productive land is degraded. On the other hand, when we look at current indicators of fragility, this is an example from the Fragile States Index, which is developed by the Fund for Peace. You can see here the scores of fragility in different colors. Now, when we group these countries based on their coverage of their land by drylands, we see that, as you can see on the figure on the left, that countries with a higher percentage of their land covered by drylands are generally more fragile, which indicates that maybe our hypothesis is correct. This is further confirmed from the map I showed you earlier with the results of our WEF Nexus Fragility Score, where indeed the ones that are shown to be more fragile are actually countries with a high percentage of their land covered by drylands. So what does it all mean? Natural resources, climate change, and fragility are deeply linked. Natural resource disputes are becoming increasingly frequent with population and income growth, the introduction of new extraction techniques, and countries' greater vulnerability to natural disasters and climate change. As the demand and pressure for natural resources grow significantly, the potential for resource-based conflict is becoming of greater concern. In the context of drylands, the link to fragility is clear. Nevertheless, challenges can be transformed into opportunities and scarcity into prosperity. Investing in dryland ecosystems can simulate positive socioeconomic and environmental developments. Restoring rangelands and sustainable land management practices can preserve dryland biodiversity, restore ecosystem functions, and halt land degradation. While breaking the link between state fragility and natural resources is challenging, effective natural resource management is crucial to building resilience. Systematic, fair, inclusive, and responsive natural resources governance is vital to effective climate change adaptation and mitigation efforts and integral to preventing conflict. Effective managing natural resources and climate change through domestic and regional policy measures, such as monitoring and better management the water, energy, food nexus interactions, trade, and strategic interventions, can strengthen resilience and development. Policies that allow for the sustainable and equitable use of natural resources, building resilience for communities, and protecting against environmental degradation are all important components of these policies. In general, through this path, the environment, natural resources, and climate change serve as key components for reducing fragility and conflict. So before I close, I should also thank Anna Freeman and Piers Cooper, who work with me at Imperial, but also Maher Salman and Stefania Giusti, the FAO, who have commissioned this project and work with us. You can also see here my contact details. If you want to contact me or if you have any questions, I will be more than happy to help.
Thank you very much. Actually, maybe virtually we can applaud Nick in London. So in London at the Imperial College, the most interesting part, as you see, of the work is really the mapping and the layering of the tri-dimensions we were talking about, addressing it, and it's a continuous work between the Imperial College of London and FAO.